All right, what's going on, guys? We are back again, Daru Strong Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Daru, and I want to thank you guys for voting and nominating me for Trainer of the Year for the World MMA Awards. I won it finally. I want to thank you guys for all of your support and all of your gratitude, and also thanking everybody who's been a part of it, my whole team. That again, like I said, I wouldn't be able to do it without them. So, thanks again. Now, we have on today a special guest. His name is Evan Peikon. He works with a lot of CrossFit athletes, but also works with other coaches in other industries and other sports. We talk a lot about bioenergetic demands and his take on the new model and what we utilize to understand where the deficiencies lie and where those rate limiting factors are going to be with an athlete so that we can get them better from a performance standpoint. So make sure you get your pen and paper out, because he is going to be dropping that knowledge that almost I want to learn more of, and also want to get in touch with him as far as getting some more collaborations going. So make sure you listen up. Now, before we go ahead and get into the conversation, I have to start with my sponsors, Athletic CBD. Go check them out. You can get a discount if you use my discount code DARU at checkout, athleticcbd.com. Go check them out now. Also, VIVO BAREFOOT. You guys been wondering what type of shoes I've been wearing on my videos. So here they are, VIVO BAREFOOT, a minimalistic shoe to help with overall functionality and athleticism. Now, let's get on to the podcast and the interview with Evan.
Welcome to the Daru Strong Podcast. Daru Strong Podcast.
Let's go. Mind over matter. Put your mind somewhere else and keep going. That little voice in your head is trying to stop you from getting to where you want to be. Be successful and keep moving forward.
With your host and world-renowned strength and conditioning coach, Phil Daru.
All right, Evan, man, thanks so much for coming on. How you doing, bro?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on.
No problem, no problem. So for the listeners that don't know who you are at this point, I know I have a large amount of MMA and combat sport listeners and viewers. Can you give us a quick rundown of who you are and what you do so far?
Yeah, so depending on what people know me from, I wear a few different hats for a handful of different companies. I'm a strength and conditioning coach, a physiologist, and I'm also a researcher. So depending on what day of the week you talk to me, I could be doing one or any of those three jobs.
Nice, nice. So how'd you get started in doing this? I know that you have a track background, correct?
Yeah, so I was a middle distance runner, track and field, and at the time I was doing an undergrad in biochem. So a lot of what I was learning in school, I was trying to figure out ways how to improve my own performance. So it's kind of like a selfish endeavor, trying to use myself as a guinea pig. And at the time I was creating a lot of content as well. So it kind of all just spiraled into eventually shifting my academic focus towards studying human performance. And this is where I am now.
Nice, nice. So you're working for, is it Train Think Tank? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, so I work for a training think tank. That's where I do my coaching, and that's where I work as a physiologist. And I also own a research and design company. So I'll essentially do research and product design for tech companies and other organizations that want some form of basic research, and then figuring out a way to turn that into a product, whether that's a physical device or a software or an intellectual product like a patent design.
Cool, cool. Yeah, so I seen you doing a lot with like Near's devices and Moxie. I do want to get into that, but first let's go about, I want to just get a basic bio from you. So you started out with track, and then you started getting into strength and conditioning and sports performance. What did you think was like the defining factor of you transitioning from being an athlete to a coach?
Yeah, so I think it wasn't a hard and fast transition. There was a period where I was full on athlete. All I cared about was my own performance. Then I started coaching while I was still an athlete. I transitioned out of competing in track and I started competing in CrossFit at the time. And some of the theories that I was playing around with, I knew that I couldn't just test them on myself. I needed to get data on other people. So my clients were other guinea pigs in a way. So I was competing myself, I was coaching competitors, and really just using all of us as ongoing experiments. And then at some point, just with how busy I was with work and not really wanting to be grinding myself down on a day-to-day basis, I transitioned out of competing and just towards coaching and researching full time.
Gotcha, gotcha. So you have an interesting look and almost like a new model in energy system training. Is that correct?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's like a new model entirely. I didn't come up with these concepts. I think what I've done that's unique is looking at a lot of the fundamental science and basic research in fields like biochemistry and molecular biology,
Yeah.
and taking that and mixing it with things that we could measure from like an applied sports science standpoint, and then trying to turn that into something practical that coaches and athletes could use.
Okay. So let's go over that, because I did watch one video of yours on YouTube on rate limiting factors. Now, can you explain a little bit more on that, and how that goes about that new model that we've been talking about, or you've been talking about as of lately?
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of people are familiar with this term VO2 max. Essentially, what VO2 max refers to is your maximum rate of oxygen consumption. It's really popular in the endurance world. I know some fighters might use that as well. And in the past, I always kind of hated these VO2 max measurements, because athletes would come to me and they'd be like, hey, coach, I have a VO2 max of 65 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Like, what do we do with this for my training? And I'm like, there's nothing we could do with that. It tells us it's basically a measuring stick, but it says nothing about how we actually get someone fitter. Yeah. So what we could do with technologies like NIRS, or there's other technologies that could do this as well, is we want to find out what is preventing you from uptaking, transporting, or utilizing more oxygen in your working muscle. And there's a lot of different things that could be limiting you, but let's boil it down to 3 primary limiters. So we'll think of it like a factory analogy. If we have a factory line, I always use a chocolate factory analogy. I have no idea how chocolates are made. So if one of your listeners is like a fighter and a chocolatier and they call bullshit on me,
doubt it, bro.
I'm sorry. So let's say we have 3 steps in our chocolate factory. We could pour the chocolates in the mold. We could put a wrapper on the chocolates, or we could stamp our logo and then we ship them out the door. We want to make some cash, and we're smart factory owners. So we want to identify what is the limiting factor. So we take a random guess and we say, hey, I think stamping the chocolates is a really hard job. Let's double the amount of people at that step in the factory. And we come back a week later and we look at our inventory and we're like, we haven't made a single more chocolate than the past week. Like, we have way more people working. We go down to the factory floor and we see a huge pile of chocolates waiting to be wrapped. We're like, oh, okay, we're smart factory owners. We're realizing wrapping the chocolates is the rate limiting factor. So instead, we put more people on that station. We get more chocolates made. We could think of VO2 max in the same way. Everyone's going to have a limiting factor. It's going to be different for different people. So your limiting factor could be the ability for your respiratory system to get oxygen into the body and get carbon dioxide out. It could be that once the oxygen diffuses into the blood of the alveoli in your lungs, your limiting factor is the ability for your heart to pump that oxygenated blood to the working muscle, or it could be for the ability of the muscle to use that oxygen. If you're limited by your muscle's ability to use oxygen, and we start training your respiratory system and your cardiovascular system, it's not doing anything for your performance. So we want to identify that rate limiting factor. Now we could be surgical with our training. That's important for the guys that you're working with. How many different skills does an MMA fighter need to work on? I've never coached one, but I'm sure it's a ridiculous amount.
Yeah, Evan, it's funny because I've been watching you for a while now, and I'm actually on the I'm in the group now for Train Think Tank. So I've been watching some of your videos too, and I'm probably going to take that NIRS course as well. But we'll talk about that after for Moxie. So I want to do that, but I'm looking at it now, and I've used VO2 max, lactate threshold. We've done numerous amount of testing, right? But at the end of the day, when it comes down to the specificity of the sport, like, it really just depends on how efficient they are in the sport. And for me, I train with a lot of elite fighters, so they are very efficient from a technical standpoint. When we're looking at rate limiting factors, I really want to find out what is that limiting factor, because I know that that's going to give them the opportunity to have an X factor inside the fight. So what I would think is, I think that you would have a great time working with these guys, because they're super hard workers, just like the CrossFit guys, but the one thing that I would say that's totally different is that they don't want to be in the weight room. They don't want to train. They don't want to weight train a lot of the times because they have so many other things that they're doing. But I would like to know exactly, when you find out these rate limiting factors, whether it be delivery, whether it be utilization, whatever the case, When you find that out, what is the specific training methods that you're going to utilize? Let's say if somebody is delivery deficient, right?
Mhm. Yeah, so that's a really good question because that's essentially where the rubber hits the road. And I think the easiest way to start out big picture is like if you Google like how do I improve my endurance, you're gonna get a dozen different answers. Some people are like do HIIT training, like high intensity intervals, low volume. That's the thing. Other people are gonna say, hey, do long, slow endurance training. You don't need to do HIIT. And then you start looking at the literature and the research, and you're like, well, shit, the research says that both of those things work. So what do I actually need to do? And that's really what understanding your limiter comes down to, because the reality is everything works, but everything doesn't work for everyone. So for example, if you know that you're limited by utilization, HIIT training is your thing. That's going to give you the good bang for your buck to improve your performance. But if you're limited by your rate of oxygen delivery, doing HIIT training, which improves your ability to utilize oxygen, that's not for you. So what this allows us to do is if you're a fighter and you're doing 10 hours of conditioning work per week, we might find out your limiter and say, hey, only 2.5 of those hours of your conditioning are actually training your limiter. Let's jettison the other 7.5 hours and go spend that doing something else. I don't know, whatever you do for training, punching people in the face.
That's basically it. Like punching people and choking people out. And for that, like our goal is fatigue management. So if we can have a directed stimulus based upon what they're lacking, that would change the game and it will eliminate a lot of that overtraining effect that we get a lot of with these fighters, because they're doing so much. And a large amount of them are all, and I don't want to say this because I know you hate this term, but like lactate work or glycolytic work. I know that we got to call it something at this point, right?
Yeah, it's a name.
Yeah, we got to call it something. But they're doing a large amount of that high volume, low rest intervals because that is specific to the sport and it's acyclical in nature, right? I'm being very selfish now on my podcast, by the way. I'm actually just asking you questions because I just want to find out now.
All good.
So, all right. So with that, let's go over NIRS and Moxie and kind of explain to the listeners what that actually is.
Yeah, so NIRS stands for near infrared spectroscopy. Really all that means is just a color of light. It's a wavelength. So the way that NIRS works is your hemoglobin, which is the oxygen carrying molecule in your blood. If it is bound to oxygen versus when it is unbound to oxygen, it absorbs two different colors of light. So what a NIRS device does is it shoots a laser into the muscle, and some of that light is absorbed by the hemoglobin, and then it's reflected back into the sensor. So what the sensor allows you to do is it quantifies the amount of blood in a working muscle, and it tells you how much of that blood is bound to oxygen. So when most people pop on a Moxie and look at a screen, it's literally just a bunch of squiggly lines on a screen. All you see is blood volume changing in live time, and you see muscle oxygen saturation changing. But with a little bit of like physiologic know-how, you could look at those squiggly lines and you could understand what's actually happening in a muscle. You could see if someone, for example, if one of your guys is throwing punches on a heavy bag and you have two different guys, they throw 20 punches in a row. You might see one of those guys, every time he's punching, it's a lot of force being generated, but he's contracting his muscles with so much force that it's cutting off his blood flow. So even though he's throwing 20 hard punches, after 10 of them, he's starting to fatigue and he's throwing less power per punch, where another guy, he throws 20. None of them are incredibly hard hits, but they're all getting steady blood flow to the muscle. So he's maintaining his power across the punches. And I don't follow fighting incredibly closely. I used to wrestle for 6 or 7 years. So at the time I was really into fighting. So these names might be completely outdated. But at the time, like Nate Diaz was like my dude. He doesn't throw any crazy shots, but he's a triathlete. So he could just keep throwing punches over and over and over again. And I'd imagine if we were to test him, he's someone that you would see that he isn't cutting off his blood flow to the working muscle. But what was the dude's name? Is Hector Lombard fighter?
Yeah. He was actually one of my guys, actually.
Okay, so someone like that carries a lot of muscle, and you're like, okay, he's probably someone that would cut off blood flow to the working muscle. So you could almost see certain body types and certain styles of fighting. And I'd imagine that a good fighter knows what type of style of fighting works well for them. So they're almost catering that to their limiter.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about that, because you get a guy like Nate, right? And his limiting factor, what would you think if you had to take a guess, what would you think his limiting factor would be, since he does have that large amount of capacity built in from his marathon running and stuff like that?
Yes, so I think it would be one of two things. It's either going to be his respiratory system, so the ability for him to get oxygen and clear carbon dioxide, or I think it would potentially also be his rate of oxygen utilization in the muscle. The reason that I can't really answer that definitively is outside of him being a triathlete, I have no idea how he trains for his sport specific work. So
I'll give it to you. It's almost the same. It's almost the same.
Okay.
It's very, what's the word? It's the same pace, it's
Okay.
very, very methodical, because he's a jiu-jitsu guy. So he's very methodical, and it's the same pace all at once. And there's a couple of guys, like I work with Dustin Poirier. He's actually fighting Conor McGregor coming up pretty soon. And a guy like Conor, who is super explosive, you would primarily think he would be more utilization limited in that perspective. Is that correct? Because he is explosive, and like he's not really the guy that kind of takes like a slower pace. Does that make sense?
So it would be the flip, the opposite. So Conor McGregor, someone who's very explosive, would be able to utilize at a very fast rate. So he would end up being limited by his ability to deliver oxygenated blood.
Okay. So I got it wrong. I gotta keep going on these videos. That's it. No. So all right. That's good. That's good. So how can someone utilize, let's say, that NIRS device or Moxie, for instance, in a testing perspective?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that we could test people. We could do like a non-sport specific test. So if you just wanted to understand, hey, one of my fighters, we're doing cyclic training for him to try and improve his VO2 max. What is the limiting factor for VO2 max? I know that's not a perfect measurement for fighters. It's the same thing as CrossFit, where for a CrossFit athlete, I would say like a high VO2 max is necessary for CrossFit. Like you're not going to be an elite CrossFitter with a low VO2 max, but just because you have a high VO2 max doesn't mean you're going to be a good CrossFitter or fighter. But I think that's at least an important enough metric that we could do a cyclic test to try and understand that. But then I would also want to do sport specific testing. So I would say, hey, when you're actually fighting, if we put a Moxie on your delt and your vastus lateralis, let's see if you're someone who's cutting off blood flow to the working muscles. One of the coaches that I do some work with, he works with boxers. So I know he's trying to assess the kinetic chain with Moxie monitors. You could also use it to auto-regulate training volume, which is going to be an important one for someone who needs to train 20 different disciplines. So if you have a fighter in the weight room and you're like, okay, we want to train whatever muscle group today, we don't necessarily know how much volume that muscle could handle, but we could put a Moxie on that working muscle and we can monitor the set to set trends and see when that muscle is no longer responding to training volume. So at that point, additional work is going to cause more fatigue. It's not going to get more adaptation. So there's a lot of different scenarios where we could use this type of technology.
Okay. All right. Perfect. So as far as not using the technology, because a lot of people probably can't afford Moxie, right? I know you use something like speed preservation. Is that correct? And can you explain a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so speed preservation is a form of testing that I use for athletes that don't have access to a Moxie monitor. And what we're trying to do with the speed preservation test is get like a rough heuristic of what type of limitation they have. So essentially the way that this test works is we would have someone, for example, do a 1K row, a 2K row, a 3K row, and a 5K row. We would establish time trials in each of those distances. And we would look, okay, if you take a 1K row, what percentage of your speed at your 1K are you preserving for a 2K? If you do a 2K row, what percentage of your speed are you preserving for a 5K? And then we're going to graph out those different ratios. And there's going to be 7 different shapes of curves that you could graph out. And what you want to do is take your curve and match it to one of those 7, because those 7 theoretical curves are going to represent different types of physiological limitations. So I have athletes across the world. I could talk to one of my athletes in Australia who's never coming to me in Rhode Island for testing, and I'll have them do these tests in their gym. And I could say, hey, I can't physiologic test you, but I at least have a good enough idea that you're probably utilization limited based on your speed preservation. Let's train you to improve your utilization and see if you get a performance improvement.
Okay, so do you have to use, let's say, like a rower could use like an assault bike or something like that too as well?
Yeah, so Technically, you could use any modality, but the issue is something like an assault bike, we just don't have enough historic data. So the reason that I like rowing or running is the way that a lot of these curves are established in the literature is that they take thousands of athletes and they'll look at those athletes' ratios across those different distances, and they'll use those to create avatars within that. So if we had a few thousand people do the tests on the assault bike, there's no reason we can't do it. I just don't have the data for that.
I may be able to get that data for you.
That'd be pretty awesome.
And I got a lot of fighters and it'll be a different world for you to get into. You know what I'm saying? Because I do have roughly 30 fighters now, and I also have remote coaching going on. But they're all elite. They're all UFC fighters or at the highest level, professional boxers, Olympian judokas. So let's talk about that after though. But definitely want to do something there because what we've seen is that a lot of people are limited with equipment too as well. So I mean, running could be the best thing for them at this point, just from a testing perspective. But then again, a lot of people, especially fighters, they can't run for shit. So it's very hard to utilize that. It's almost like, okay, we're gonna do swimming for a particular methodology of training, but if that person can't swim, then it's basically doing nothing for them, but just basically tiring them out. So if they're not efficient, then it's very hard for us to get it done. And then there's other ways, like Evan, like I was thinking more in terms of specificity, right? So what about like acyclical movements? Is that something that you could test, or is that just not enough evidence and data for us to utilize yet?
So what we could do with acyclic movements is we can't create like avatars, but what we could do is assess a specific individual. So I do work with some field sport athletes and again, acyclic sports. Mm-hmm. So to give like a little scenario that I think we could create an analogy for fighting out of this. Imagine we have two soccer players. So one of them, every time they kick the ball or they change direction or they pivot, they cut off arterial blood flow to the working muscle. So if you're cutting off arterial blood flow, that means you're not getting oxygenated blood into the muscle. You're not getting waste products out of the muscle. If we have another soccer player, they're doing the exact same actions, but they're getting steady blood flow to the working muscle. Which one of those athletes do you think is going to fatigue quicker in the game or be more predisposed to injuries? And we can make the same comparison with fighting. If you have a guy who every time they throw a really hard kick, they cut off blood flow to the working muscle, how many of those hard kicks do you think they're going to throw before they fatigue? Versus if they're able to continually throw hard kicks or hard punches without cutting off blood flow, they're going to be more efficient. And in a 5-round fight, they're going to be able to keep the same output across all of those rounds.
Yeah. Do you think that has to do, I mean, obviously that has a lot to do with efficiency too, with movement patterns, but physiology is going to help play a part in that as well. I think that if we can find out, just like you're talking about, like where their limiting factors are, and then look at, okay, are they efficient in those movements, whether it be a kick, a punch, a takedown, and then be calm with that, because there's a large amount of psychological aspects go into a fight game and in any sport in general, right? Especially in CrossFit. And I heard you talk about one guy turning, cyclical work or acyclical work into cyclical work, or making it seem like it is. I think that plays a huge role, correct?
Yeah, for sure. And when we talk about turning acyclic work into cyclical work, what we really mean by that is that they're able to get steady blood flow and oxygen to the muscle throughout that workout. So even if they're doing thrusters and burpees and kettlebell swings, if you're monitoring their local muscle physiology, it looks like they're on a rower. So if you imagine something similar happening in fighting, if someone could work on their breathing mechanics and they know how to breathe while they're throwing a punch or throwing a kick, and they're efficient, they know when to contract the muscle versus when to relax the muscle. It's probably relatively similar that they could just keep going and turn it into an almost cyclical event. Obviously, barring the fact that if someone's trying to punch you, you're going to have to brace really hard. So I'm sure that makes your job much more difficult.
Yeah, it's a little different. And that's why, like, it's fun for me now at this point. When I was fighting at the lower levels at the regional scene, you could see the transitions of, like, all right, there's a spike in intensities, but based off of just not being in there for so long. And then when you get a little bit more experience, and then you kind of get punched a lot of times, and you're not really feeling that sense of, oh shit, you know what I mean? And you're ready to keep going forward. And the good thing now is that with the elite guys that I have, it's not that bad. It is still, don't get me wrong, there is a large amount of anxiety that goes into a fight, but you do see that evenness there. But when it comes to training in the weight room, when it comes to like controlled environments, I found that even with guys that can spar for 12, 15 rounds, whatever, and they're super efficient, when you put them on like a prowler or you put them on an assault bike and you control those variables, you can basically tear them down as easy as possible, right? What do you think is that factor? Is it because of they're just not getting enough of that controlled training, or is it just because their physiology needs to adapt to the specific demands?
I think it could be a few different things. For something like a prowler specifically, one, it could be in that hunched over posture. There, a lot of guys, when they push the prowler, they kind of go into like a little bit of a kyphotic position, so they can't get full rib cage expansion. They can't let their diaphragm vertically expand during expiration. So it basically restricts their breathing to an extent. Could also be that they're contracting and bracing really hard, so they're restricting blood flow to the working muscles. So the prowler really sets guys up to create a oxygen delivery limitation where you essentially desaturate the working muscles very quickly. And in a fight, guys know how to control their pace. They know how to use like little strategies to manage their fatigue. You're not managing your fatigue when you're pushing a prowler. You're basically just trying to hang on for your life.
They try to like they'll try to pace themselves. I can't let them. I'll be screaming in their face and everything else, and they don't want to look like a bitch in front of me and in front of the entire gym, so they just keep moving forward. But that's interesting. But for that though, do you feel like that would be detrimental for their overall game? Because when you talk about like relax, contract, being able to do that as fast as possible, those are the elite athletes, those people that can do that as fast as possible. But keeping them under high tension, you feel like that's maybe a detriment to their overall game, or is that something that can be used?
Man, the hard thing is I don't think there's a right answer to this. I think it's really going to come down to what's limiting this person's performance, because if they are someone who's limited by their ability to use oxygen in the muscle, you might be training them to contract hard and utilize oxygen at a fast rate. So I think what it comes down to is, one, we can look at fighters and we could say, are you limited by energetics in a fight? Like, is your VO2 max a limiting factor? If it is, it's someone who like after a round, they're just gassed out and they kind of become worthless. For that person, you're like, well, doesn't really matter if we improve your skills as a fighter because your conditioning is trash. Versus someone else like a Nate Diaz. Do you think improving his VO2 max is going to make him a better fighter? Probably not. So that could be step one of saying like, hey, is energetics a limiting factor for you? Yes or no? If the answer is no, go focus on something else. But if the answer is yes, then we need to say, well, if energetics are the limiting factor, what specifically is limiting you? Is it your oxygen delivery? Is it your respiratory system? Like if you have a respiratory limitation, maybe a prowler doesn't allow you to train that sufficiently because you're not letting the diaphragm contract through its full range of motion for a long period of time. Like you can't push your prowler for 30 minutes straight.
Yeah, I mean, I probably could make them, but I'm not gonna do it. I won't do it to them. And you know what? It is funny because I do put a large emphasis on quote unquote aerobic training, right? And what I mean by that is just lower intensity training, because when you're talking about restorative work, I know that that's gonna help recover the body in a sense, especially if you keep that heart rate in those lower ranges. Can you talk a little bit more about like those systems of energies like aerobic, anaerobic, lactic, and why do you feel like we use all of that at once? And go into that story that you found, or that study that you found, where was it 100 milliseconds to 8 milliseconds? Can you go into that a little bit?
Yes. So essentially, when we speak about energy systems, oftentimes coaches, athletes, I've spoken this way myself. Like I was a track and field athlete, so we literally classified people as like the anaerobic guys, the aerobic guys. I'm an aerobic guy. I can't sprint for my life. But when we speak in these ways, we make these like hard and fast distinctions between anaerobic energy production, aerobic energy production. And when we look at traditional models of energy system training, they really compartmentalize things. They'll say from 0 to 5 seconds, you're primarily using ATP stores or PCR stores. Then from 10 seconds to 20 or 10 to 20 seconds, you're using the glycolytic system, and then you expand it out. Now it's the lactic system. And then after the lactic system, it's the aerobic system. And The more we expand out that traditional model, the less accurate it becomes. I've heard coaches say if you're doing an event that's under 2 minutes, it is not an aerobic event. But one of the things that becomes really jarring to coaches when they try and use something like a Moxie monitor is they put a Moxie on and you tell them sprint as hard as you can for 10 seconds. And as soon as you start, you see oxygen depleting very fast. The first time I used the device, I was like, this thing's a piece of shit. But the thing that became really interesting to me is instead of just rejecting that outright, I wanted to understand why are we observing these trends and why is this what's happening? So what I started to do is looking at a lot of the biochemistry literature and kind of rethinking energetics. So instead of thinking in these compartmentalized terms of the aerobic system, anaerobic system, one of the things that we see in the literature is that the support of muscle contraction requires a rapid non-oxidative ATP production on the millisecond time scale. So what that means is within 0 to 15 milliseconds, PCR or phosphocreatine is going to be broken down to restore ATP to fuel contractions. But we already run into some issues because traditionally they would say glucose is the fuel source for this to happen. But the issue is we don't store that much glucose in a working muscle. So we need a different source of non-oxidative energy. One of the things that we see in the biochemistry literature is that there's an enzyme called glycogen phosphorylase that could really rapidly increase its activity on the millisecond time scale. So as a result of that, we could say glycogen is broken down to restore phosphocreatine, which restores ATP. This is happening in under 15 milliseconds. And then we would say, okay, well, how does that glycogen get restored? Because if ATP is broken down, PCR restores ATP, glycogen breakdown restores PCR, what restores glycogen? Well, between contractions, the ATP needed to resynthesize or put glycogen back together is going to come from oxidizing lactate. So this is where people are like, wait, what are you talking about? Lactate's a fatigue byproduct or it's a poisonous metabolite. That's actually very inaccurate. The reason that we think that is in traditional exercise physiology, this started with Archibald Hill in like the 1920s. They would electrically stimulate muscles until rigor occurred. And at the time they would say, okay, let's pull a blood sample now. And they would see high levels of lactate in the muscle. And then they inferred, oh, we stimulate this muscle until it literally cannot stop contracting, the muscle seizing up, and lactate is present. Lactate has to cause muscle fatigue. And it's the classic issue of like, well, correlation doesn't equal causation. Lactate was present at the time of muscle fatigue. It's not actually the cause. If anything, lactate is one of the most important fuel sources during this process. And the reason that lactate pools up at the point of fatigue is it's really just due to inefficiency of this process. So since all of this is happening on such a short time scale, what we could essentially say is that looking at oxygen kinetics, or the rate that oxygen is utilized and restored, gives us a very detailed understanding of what phosphocreatine and ATP are doing. There's a study by a lab group called McNally et al.'s lab group called simultaneous in vivo measurements of HbO2 and phosphocreatine kinetics. And what they showed in this study is that you could map the rate that phosphocreatine is broken down onto the rate that oxygen is being utilized, and their recoveries line up as well. So when we're using a Moxie monitor and you start sprinting and oxygen is immediately being utilized, that's the same rate that phosphocreatine is being utilized. And when you see oxygen bottom out and hit 0%, that's when you're truly anaerobic. You're fucked at that point. Like, you are not doing any more productive work. At best, you're trying to hang on, like not throw up on yourself or like poop on yourself, whatever it is. So this idea that we have this anaerobic system that we could tap into and it's this powerful system, there's really no justification of that, because when we actually put people in an anaerobic environment, they're just hanging on for their dear life. So the way that I think about energy system training is that all training is aerobic and all training is lactic. Lactate and oxygen are always part of the energy transduction process. And this is why, instead of focusing on this guy's limited by anaerobic power, or this guy's limited by aerobic endurance, I take a bigger picture standpoint and I say, what organ systems are limiting? Is it the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, or muscular system? And then we don't even need to talk about these like bioenergetic processes, which just becomes overly messy.
Yeah, yeah, and then you get into that rabbit hole of like lactic power and aerobic power, aerobic capacity, and you just blew probably everybody's mind just now by what you just said, because for a long time we've all thought that, right? PCR, anaerobic, alactic, and we worked in these zones based off of time frames, you know, and when you're looking at it from a, and I go back to combat sports, it's like, all right, so what are we going to be training to enhance quality of an athlete when it's an acyclical event on top of a long duration, let's say a 25-minute fight? Well, now you have to work on all these demands in order for you to be good, right? To be successful. So it goes back to, all right, now finding out what these rate limiting factors are going to be and then focusing on that at what particular time. And then you can categorize it wherever you want and then periodize it depending on where the fight is. So that's very interesting. And I'm definitely going to have you on again, by the way, just for my own selfish purposes.
Sure.
But I'm pretty sure we're going to get a lot of questions afterwards. I have a mentorship group that I have about 400 coaches from around the world. I'm going to make sure that they follow you and also everybody on here too as well. But I do want to talk about this though, critical power calculations. Can you explain a little bit more on that? Because that's interesting to me.
Yeah, for sure. So to give like a non-hyper complicated definition of critical power,
Please.
because if you look at the like textbook definitions, it's like the hyperbolic relationship between power and duration. No one cares about that. So to give you a more practical example, let's say your maximum wattage on a bike is 1,000 watts. And I say, okay, Phil, you're going to ride at 750 watts to complete failure today. And next, a week later, I'm going to say you're going to ride to 500 watts to complete failure. And then you're going to ride 350 watts to complete failure. So now we have 3 data points that have power and duration. Let's say 750 watts, you go a minute, 500 watts, you go 5 minutes, 350 watts, you go 10 minutes. I don't really care what the actual are. What we're going to do is take those 3 dots on the graph and we're going to calculate the slope of that line. In going back to like 10th grade algebra, where that slope levels off the y-intercept, like if everyone remembers back to like y equals mx plus b, that formula that they like try and drill into your head in high school that no one cares about. Well, that is actually apparently really useful for sport performance.
We should have paid attention, damn it.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm almost 30. I'm reteaching myself these formulas that I intentionally forgot 15 years ago.
Yeah.
But that value, the b in that equation, the y-intercept, is our critical power. And what critical power essentially represents is the maximum output that you could sustain indefinitely before your oxygen utilization outstrips your oxygen supply. So another way of saying that would be critical power is your maximum steady state value. So this becomes really useful for a few different reasons. One, if we have a fighter and we want to quantify their fitness, maybe we don't have VO2 max testing. A gas analyzer costs $10,000 to $30,000, but we still need a way to quantify if they're improving their energetics. Well, we could over time continually recalculate critical power because critical power is intimately linked to oxygen delivery. So if you're improving your VO2 max and your oxygen delivery and utilization, your critical power should go up.
Gotcha.
The other thing that's really useful for endurance sports is if you know someone's critical power, you could calculate time to exhaustion at any power output above their critical power. So in that example that I gave you, we tested you at 750, 500, and 350 watts. And let's say we find out your critical power is 225 watts. I could tell you exactly how long you could go at any wattage between 226 and 1,000 before you'll fail. So that's more practical for endurance sports, but the same concept applies because there's a finite amount of work that you could do above your critical power.
Yeah.
So now if we sidestep into a related concept called critical energetic rate, this is about the maximum rate of energy turnover before you start to deplete your gas tank, so to speak. And this is one of my favorite topics because this is what my personal research focuses on, is modeling time to exhaustion in acyclic sports.
Yeah.
So if we were to create an analogy for this, let's say we have a electric car, and this electric car is a self-perpetuating motion machine. So if this car is moving at 50 miles per hour or below, it can move forever because its battery recharges faster than it depletes.
Yeah.
If this car drives faster than 50 miles per hour, the battery drains, and the higher above 50 miles per hour it goes, the faster the battery is going to drain. If we drive below 50 miles per hour, the battery recharges. So now what we could do is we could say, okay, if you want to drive 100 miles as fast as you can, we could mathematically calculate exactly how to get you there so you finish with 0% battery in your tank. Using something like a Moxie, we could actually figure this out for a human being as well. So if we were to figure out this critical energetic rate, as well as the rate that someone could recharge their battery and deplete their battery, you could essentially have someone operate with the perfect pacing. So if you wanted to run 100 miles, I could tell you in live time to slow down or speed up by essentially creating a calculation that's going to determine how full your battery is and how quickly you could recharge it.
That's crazy, man. So like for a 25-minute fight, right? I could say, all right, you could go at this particular pace. Let's just say for all intents and purposes, right? What we're talking about here. If I was like, okay, you got about 3 rounds left in the tank, I could actually tell them that, right? Now, I probably wouldn't because of psychological reasons, but I know in my mind, I'm like, all right, he's got about 3 rounds before it's all over, right? Before you're probably going to be put to sleep, right? Can we train that after finding out where your critical power is, and then we can basically find out, okay, we can push it a little bit further?
Yeah, for sure. So let's say you were monitoring your guy in a fight. For whatever reason, the UFC allows you to be strapped up with Moxies and somehow they don't fall off your fighter. You could tell your guy, start pushing harder. And you would be able to, in live time, calculate his time to exhaustion. So you might know, like, man, if he keeps up this pace, he's like roasted in 2 minutes from now. Yeah. So then you could tell them when to dial back. Yeah. But if you could do those calculations, you could also identify how to either make that gas tank bigger or figure out how to get someone to work at a higher power output or a higher speed before that gas tank depletes. So that comes down to identifying someone's limiter. Your same limiter for VO2 max is also going to be the thing that raises that floor of critical power, critical energetic rate.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm gonna have to talk to you after this about that too as well.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so I don't want to take too much of your time, but I did want to get one more thing out. So you are doing a lot of research now, and you are working. Are you working for an institute, or are you doing your own studies, and how is that going?
Yes, so a little bit of both. So I have a company called Emergent Performance Lab. It's essentially an R&D company. So I fund my own research. So I funnel money into that and I conduct studies and write papers. I also do research for other organizations as well. So right now I work for some tech companies where we'll do basic research for them as proof of concept, then we'll try and turn that into products. So it's a little bit of both.
Nice. Perfect, man. So what else have you got going on? I know you have a coaching course, right? A mentorship too as well.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead and tell people where they can find you there and what they can do if they want to learn more.
Yes, so the easiest place to find me, everything that I put out is on Instagram. So my handle is Evan, EVAN _PEIKON. So I have coaching. Unfortunately, right now I'm not really taking on clients anymore, but I also do offer mentorships. I have different courses, and you could also just follow my research, read the papers. It's always nice to get some view counts up on those.
Yeah, man. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, guys, check it out. This guy I vouch for. Go check him out on Instagram. Make sure I'm talking to the camera right now, Evan. Don't worry. Go check him out. And Evan, I appreciate your time, brother. Thanks again. We'll have you on again in no time. So thanks for joining us, and hope you have a great day.
Sounds great, man. Thank you so much for having me on.